Welcome to Judica County. My name is Josh Whitaker. I'm your host today. We've assembled a panel of attorneys to talk to you today a little bit about what a seller can expect from the closing process in North Carolina. So here we're concerned with someone who is selling residential real estate. Real quick, let me introduce the panel and then we'll get right to it. Down at the end, I've got Mr. Damian McCullers.
Hello.
I have Miss Ashley Pinner.
Hi.
Attorney Joe Hamer.
Hey.
We're all attorneys with the law firm of McCullers, Whitaker, and Hamer. It's a law firm that has offices in Garner, Clayton, and Raleigh. We are North Carolina licensed attorneys, so when we talk to you, we are talking about North Carolina specific issues. And the reason that we've put this together is we often will represent buyers who are buying residential property, and so we will conduct and coordinate the closing transaction. As part of that, we don't represent you as the seller, but we do need a lot of information from you, and we do need to talk to you a lot. So in North Carolina, a seller can always hire their own attorney to represent them in a real estate transaction. Again, we would be the closing attorneys. We're representing your buyer. You can go get your own attorney to handle your transaction, to communicate with us, or the North Carolina Bar allows us to communicate with you to the extent that we need to get things done for our buyer so that they can actually purchase your house and consummate the transaction. Where I'm going to start is if you're closing with our firm, you have probably gotten an email from us that contains an engagement letter and is going to be asking you for some information that we're going to need to get the closing on track. Ashley is going to talk to you about some of the information we're going to be asking you for.
So when you get our seller questionnaire, when you're closing with our office or your buyer is closing with our office, of course we're going to want your name, your good contact information. We're going to need to know your marital status. If you listen to the buyer's portion of this, marital status is important there and just as important on the selling side as well. Common phrases, takes one to buy, two to sell. So if you are married, regardless of whether or not your spouse is on title, most of the time that spouse is going to have to sign the deed as well.
And Ashley, I'm going to stop you there because this just came up the other day, and it was a lender who was asking me this question they should have known. So again, in North Carolina, you're either married or you're not. Separated is not a marital status. If you are married, whether you inherited the property, whether your spouse is on the deed, if you're married, in North Carolina, your spouse has a marital interest in the property and they will need to sign several documents. And if you have questions about that, that's pretty much what we can tell you as representatives for your buyer. If you have any questions about that, I would highly recommend you get your own attorney and discuss some of those issues. But from our perspective, and you'll have to sign an affidavit stating whether you're married or not. And so if you say you're married or we find out that you're married, that spouse has to sign. So just be ready for that. That comes up more often than you might think. Sorry, back to you.
Absolutely. In addition to that, we're going to need to know, of course, if you have any mortgages against the property and who those lenders are. We do need your Social Security number oftentimes to be able to get a mortgage payoff from your lender. So I know sometimes, especially if we're not technically your attorney, that may be something uncomfortable, some uncomfortable information to provide, but certainly we are safeguarding that and using it only for those very limited purposes. We want to know about your HOA dues if you have any. If you live in a community that has a homeowners association, we need that information. It's very important information for closing, information that we'd prefer to have the sooner the better. As with all of this, actually, naturally with your mortgage as well.
And I'll comment on that too. In North Carolina, the closing process is pretty quick. So if you're living in New York or California or escrow states where the process is a little more drawn out, North Carolina, the closing process from the time the contract is signed to closing date can be as quick as 2 weeks, 2 weeks to 30 days. So things move pretty fast if there's no hiccups. And one of the things we need to do to get your closing moving as fast as we can is this information back as quickly as possible. And I'll let you continue.
And this is something that a lot of times you'll end up filling out with your realtor if you're working with one, because there are some pieces of information that they would provide as well or help you with. In addition to that, we also like to know if you have your title policy from where you purchased the property. That is very helpful information. If you don't have it, usually there's a way that we can kind of dig around and find it. But it's fantastic if you have that and can provide it to us.
One other limited, it doesn't come up as much, but it's also very, very important if you are a seller, is if you have a manufactured home that you're selling, it's imperative that you get the information that's requested on our seller info sheet, which is generally manufacturer information, serial number, title information, because that's critical information that we're going to have to use to be able to get to the closing table. And a lot of times you see folks who either didn't even realize that that information existed or have to go and find the plate on the manufactured home, but it's something that you need to be on top of earlier rather than later.
The other thing I would add too, we've talked about just generally our seller being an individual or a married couple, but sellers are often trusts, trustees, LLCs, foreign entities. And if you're one of those, you're going to have to provide to us documentation that shows that you are who you claim to be. So if you're a trust, we're going to require a trust certification. If you're an LLC, we're going to require an operating agreement because we need to be able to see who's authorized to sign for the LLC. And there's some wrinkles there. And so those are additional documents that we would be speaking to you about if you were not an individual. Again, most trusts and most LLCs and corporate sellers have attorneys that we deal with, so that probably won't be a huge issue for you. Marital status, I think, is the biggest issue we see on things coming back to us.
And really, the number one thing you can do to make the process smooth and easy is get us this information back as quickly as possible. A lot of people don't realize, but like Josh was saying, we get to the closing table pretty quickly. And we have to order your payoffs, we have to order your HOA dues, and the turnaround times for the ordering of those things can be substantial from various lenders. So if you get us this information 7 days out from closing, and you've got a 7 to 8 day turnaround for your payoff, it's going to cause a delay.
So yeah, so one of the things we're doing as your closing attorney is obviously we're going to be paying off any liens that you have attached to this property, a Wells Fargo mortgage, your local bank equity line. Those all have to be paid off and canceled. And what Joe was speaking to is we're going to request that information directly from your lender with the information that you've given us. And some lenders, we get that almost immediately. Some lenders, I think the statute in North Carolina gives them 10 business days.
And they take it.
And so there are some lenders that will take a full 10 business days to get us that back, which is, about 2 weeks, which really slows us down. And then I would also add, if you're selling this property and there's some financial distress, if you're behind on your payments or your property is in the foreclosure process, we're going to find out. It's easier just to let us know ahead of time because that'll slow down us getting a payoff request as well. If you're in foreclosure, it's going to take us some extra time. If you're in bankruptcy, we're going to need some things from the bankruptcy court. So any kind of financial information like that, most people do not want to share that for obvious reasons, but it's very important for us so that we can make sure you close on time. So I would add that too.
And, I guess practically speaking, as a seller, you're going to sign substantially less documentation, generally speaking, than you are if you're a buyer that's closing on a loan. Buyers will come in and sign numerous things provided by the bank. But as a seller, you're really going to sign a few things, and it's a lot less. Practically speaking, when you come in to close, there's a couple of options for you there. I'd say that, generally we will encourage, if possible, our sellers to get by and sign ahead of time. New TRID requirements came down not too long ago that require buyers and sellers to kind of be separated to protect personal information. So you don't necessarily have to come on the day of closing. It can be done ahead of time. You don't even have to come to our office necessarily. If you want, our seller information sheet gives the option that we can just send you everything. You can sign in front of a notary. You can get those back to us, and a lot of times that's going to make everything a lot easier on the day of closing, because it's just one less thing that you got to worry about, and we can kind of make sure we've got everything in line before that day actually comes.
Yeah, that's the real advantage of being a seller that a buyer doesn't have. A buyer's going to have to come down and sit with us on the day of closing to finalize the transaction. But the seller's part can be done ahead of time, again, in your attorney's office, in front of your notary. We will have to have originals back, so there's FedEx involved or hand delivering. But when I sell property, I always get my stuff done right away. There's no reason to wait. If you're a seller, you can jump in there and just get it done. Yeah.
One of the probably bigger questions that a seller is going to have after closing is, when am I getting my money? I'd say that's probably the number one question. We're very accommodating as far as what we'll do. We can have a check for you to pick up. We can overnight a check to you. But more and more commonly, we're getting asked to wire those proceeds out. If you caught our Buyers podcast, we talk a lot about wire fraud, how prevalent that wire fraud is. Josh, I don't know if you wanted to talk briefly about how much we see that and what we do to kind of get around it.
Sure. So one of the things that we're seeing is a trend across the nation for settlement attorneys, closing attorneys, is bad actors trying to insert themselves into your transaction. So your realtor or you may have a Hotmail or Gmail or Yahoo address that's been hacked and you don't know it, but people are watching you in real time, and it's more common than you may think. And so these bad actors just sit around and try to figure out what's going on in your life. And if they figure out you're selling property, they kind of figure out that you've got some money that's probably going to come to you, and probably as a wire. And so these bad actors will insert themselves into the transaction. They'll spoof emails. They'll pretend to be someone from an attorney's office or someone who works with your agent, and try to get you, try to get us wiring instructions for you that are wrong. And so we take a lot of steps to make sure if we're going to wire you proceeds, we know ahead of time where they're going, and we've been able to confirm those. So underneath this podcast, you'll have a link to a couple of documents, and one of them we call seller wiring instructions. And so if you're not going to come to closing, there you go. If you're not going to come to closing, we're going to send you a little package of things that need to be signed and notarized: your deed, a lien waiver, fairly simple documents if nothing crazy has come up in your title search. And this is going to ask you for your wiring instructions. And so they're going to ask for your account information. And then this document has to be notarized. And we're going to get it back with everything else. Once that happens, that is the only place we'll wire your proceeds. If we get another random email in a week from somebody pretending to be you, say, no, I've changed my mind, I want to wire these funds somewhere else, we're not going to do it. If your agent sends us an email saying, well, they want this money wired somewhere else, we're not going to do it. The only thing we'll do, if for some reason you do not want us to use these wiring instructions, the only option for you will be a check. And that helps us prevent a bad actor getting involved through email or some other non-secure manner to try to take your proceeds. And we've had a few people get mad at us because they did honestly decide they wanted to change where the wire went, but we just can't do it. It's just too risky in our current environment to pivot when we have a notarized signed document that we know came from you. We're going to honor those instructions, or we're just going to have a check at the office that somebody can come pick up.
And I think this is a good time to kind of talk about and let a buyer know that you may want to allow some time as well. We're going to do everything we can and make every effort to get the wire out as soon as we can and as soon as we're funded and everything is a go. But that they should still allow some time. I know sometimes people are in the position where they may be attempting to buy another property. And they're anxious about getting their proceeds from their closing where they sold. But you should allow some time to allow for that wire to go through or for checks to get cut for you to come pick it up, just so you kind of have that leeway. Because if you set it up where you think your buyer may close at 2 and you've set yours up for 4, there could be anything that goes on, or it may just be that it's just a backlog and we just can't get it done right away. And again, we make every effort to do so, but just understand that those proceeds might not be readily available at that time.
It's not an instantaneous process.
No, if you got your buyer's closing at 2, don't expect to wire at 2:30 because you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. And our seller wiring instructions letter, it reads very sternly. You'll see a lot of MWH will refuse and big letters. But it's for your protection. We've seen horror stories, and we've seen a lot of fraud attempts where people, right after closing, will send emails with just literally one letter or one digit different than your email, asking for a wire to be sent elsewhere. And those attempts are not always the best, and we really do a great job of vetting those. And that's kind of why we do this, so that we're protecting your money. As angry as folks may get, it's for their own protection.
It's called spoofing.
It's called spoofing. This is the dictionary term in Webster's.
The other thing I would add, we're often asked, if your buyer's closing at 10 and you're buying a new house at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, you'll work ahead of time with your realtors in our office and your attorney's office to get everything scheduled so that everything works out about as smooth as it can be. It's not something we usually find out at the last minute. We're often asked to wire your proceeds to your closing attorney's office. Happy to do it. No problems doing that. And we try to get those out as quick as we can. But everybody should realize that the closing process, like Ashley said, is not instantaneous. After your buyer closes with us, even if you've already signed all your documents, we got a couple of hours of work usually before we can get on record, get everything finalized, and get your money off to where it needs to go. And most people understand that. We run into a few people who kind of have unreasonable expectations, who don't have the right folks helping them out. But for the most part, I know in our office, we usually try to send wires out. Anything that's ready by 10 goes out around 10 or 11, and anything that's ready in the afternoon usually goes out about 4, unless there's a specific need, which certainly make us aware of, and we'll do our best to try to handle. One thing I know that we haven't talked about, we talked about the information we're going to ask about your mortgage payoffs, your HOA dues. We need that because we need to pay those off. We need to make sure everything's current. But the other thing, we may find a title defect. And so we're going to do a title search on your property. Sometimes we have to go back 60, 70, 80, 100 years. So we're going to take a good hard look at your title to your property and make sure there's no defects. Something we see a lot, if you've owned your property for 25 years, your first mortgage may have never got canceled. You paid it off, you refinanced, but no one ever went back and made sure it got canceled. Or you may have an equity line that you got free as part of a promotion with the bank and you never used it, but it's still out there as lien on your property for 15 years. And so we'll find those, but we don't know they're a problem until we get back the information that you provide. So once you tell us what liens you know of, we compare it to what liens we found, and that's how we find title defects. And so if you wait around and we don't get your information till 3 weeks into the process, then that title defect's going to come up pretty late in the game. And those things can get cleared up, but they take some time.
We see nightmare scenarios, and just further expounding on what you said, even worse than a deed of trust that you took out that you forgot about and didn't realize, or deeds of trust from 2 owners prior to you with banks that don't exist anymore. And these things happen, and they're not the type of things that we can learn about days before closing and still resolve. We
really cannot put together the final picture until we have all of our information from our buyer, their lender, you, the agents. And once we get our title search, which is not instantaneous either, that title search, depending on what we need from the courthouse, we can do a lot of it electronically, but we still have to send people to courthouses to get files. It's just not instantaneous. And so, it takes us time to get the full picture. And once we get the full picture, if you have a title defect, we're going to be reaching out to you. And that's never a call you want to get. It confuses a lot of people why we're contacting them. Why is this a problem now? We do our best to try to explain. But in the end, if we're reaching out to you because there's a title defect, we're going to help you the best we can. But then you may need your own attorney to step in and help. You may need to make a couple of trips to whatever bank may have the mortgage loan. There's going to be some things you have to do, some legwork that has to get done. And we represent the buyer. We want to help you clear your title, but we don't represent you. So there's only so much that we can really do to help you. We get you going in the right direction, let you know what we've seen. But besides that, it'll take some legwork. One other issue that we see a lot, and it's more of an issue for buyers than sellers, but is the transfer of keys. And so in North Carolina, your buyers, if the closing is scheduled for the 28th or the end of the month or whatever day, your buyer's going to come to closing. We're going to have them sign their final documents. We'll send everything to the lender to get funded. There's some things that we have to do, but you and your buyer, through your agents or through attorneys, or you need to discuss the transfer of keys. In North Carolina, liability rests with the sellers until the deed is recorded at the courthouse. That's kind of the final step. So our buyer may come in and close at 9 a.m., but we may not be on record till later in the afternoon, depending on their lender and whatever the circumstances may be. More often than not, it gets recorded fairly early in the day, but that deed may not go on record till later in the day. Your buyers may have a moving truck. If you haven't discussed moving, they may think they can get right into your house, but that's going to be your call as the seller. Some sellers are comfortable letting buyers move some things in, even though the deed hadn't been recorded. And some sellers don't want to, even though there's liability there, some sellers, or the liability is small, some sellers have a problem with that. And that's something that we can't really advise you on. I like to make you aware of it, just so parties talk. And no one's surprised the day of closing at the last minute that they're going to have to wait another 6 hours to get in the house. And we see people all over the spectrum. Some people don't care. Some people do care. But anyway, it's something that you need to be aware of, and it's something that you need to be thinking about, so it's not a last-minute ordeal. We really try to make closing day as smooth as humanly possible. And if we've addressed everything in our engagement letters and the information we've sent to you, then it's going to be a smooth transaction. Even if we hit a bump in the road, we can all work together to try to get through it. It's very rare that we find something that completely derails a closing. We're going to get there. If everybody's in the same boat and everybody's trying to get to the same place, we're going to get there. I don't really have anything else. You guys have anything you want to add?
That's it for me.
Well, I think that's going to do it for our podcast. Again, just taking a seller through some of the information and some of the process for a residential closing in North Carolina. Again, we're all attorneys in North Carolina. We're only talking about North Carolina property. We're not licensed in any other states. I feel like I have to make that disclaimer. Absolutely. You don't know who's watching.
Get us your information, sellers.
Yep, that's the big thing. Get us your information as fast as you can. and hopefully we'll have a nice, good, smooth transaction. I hope this was helpful. We'll see you next time.